Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Back in the classroom here, going to look at just two of Percy Shelley's poems. May or may not remember from some of the other little snippets of content been peppering out regarding these English Romantic poets. Percy Shelley was married to Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, right? You've probably heard of, familiar with that. Percy and Mary Shelley were close friends with Lord Byron, and they traveled with Lord Byron throughout Europe after Byron, self-exiled from England. And one of their companions was Byron's physician, Dr. Polidori, and he had lots of drugs in his case. They took lots of drugs together, and Dr. Polidori came up with the idea of vampires. Wow. So here we have all of these imaginative, supernatural things being created here. If you recall from Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the dead crewmates were animated, became zombies. Boy, this is such a fascinating time that we have in this short little romantic period. So let's hop back into Shelley, and let's take a look first at his Ode to the West Wind. And it's important to remember that these later romantics were all really influenced by one important volume. And you probably know what that important volume was, Lyrical Ballads. If you remember, how did William Wordsworth define poetry? The spontaneous, that's right. Now, if you look at the author's note for Ode to the West Wind, right? How does this connect to that? It's just like Wordsworth and Tintern Abbey, right? He went, experienced, came back, boom, put it down. Spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. This is something that we're seeing over and over and over again with these romantic writers. So now, in this poem, Ode to the West Wind, there's sections that are numbered, and inside of each section, there are the different stanzas. And each stanza, you'll notice, there's the triplet of lines, and at the end, there's a couplet. Interesting little organization here that Shelley gave us. So let's take a look here at the first section. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven, like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. Right? So what season is it? It's autumn. Right? So what happens at autumn? All the foliage comes down, right? See that? Yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes, right? So all the leaves come down and they're being picked up and blown by the west wind. Now, as far as archetype goes, with the west wind, that's like the sun setting in the west, as opposed to the sun rising in the east or an east wind, right? If it's westerly, that's going to suggest to us the end of life, right? The sun going down, coming out of the west. And this ties in with the season of being autumn. So everything is coming to an end. Everything is closing out. And look at how the leaves are being described here. Yellow, black, pale, hectic red. It's like those images of death are being reflected in the landscape. The winged seeds where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave, until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow her clarion o'er the dreaming earth, and fill driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air with living hues and odors plain and hill. But so this, right, the seeds are being carried down too, right, and naturally being covered up. And then what's going to happen in the spring? So here Shelley is. It's kind of a depressing, bleak landscape. But he knows, right, that after autumn, after fall, what happens? Right? So here we are, right? We're in right? We're seeing all of this death. But what's going to happen when we get to spring? What do we have? Rebirth. New life. And then what happens with the cycle? It picks back up again. So Shelley is seeing in nature this idea of regenerative cycles. Now, notice what Shelley calls the west wind. What does he call it? Yes, a spirit, a wild spirit. Right? And again, we're seeing lots of threads, lots of connections here throughout these poets. Some of these common threads, right? Elevation of nature, transcendentalism, taking on source of divinity. Wild spirit, which art moving everywhere. Destroyer and preserver. Here, oh here. Right? So then, in the second section, Shelley goes in and starts to describe, give us lots of really, really good imagery, the storm that is being carried along. Right? So there's lightning and rain that ties in with, the ending of the year here and these images of death. And then let's look at the closing couplet to that second section. Vapors from whose solid atmosphere black rain and fire and hail will burst. Oh, here. Wow. Look, why is the rain described as black? Well, because it's not a spring rain, which is livening the landscape. It's not bringing new life to it. It's black. It's death. Now, continuing into the third section. Thou who didst waken from his summer dreams the blue Mediterranean, where he lay lulled by the coil of his crystalline streams. Right? So looking at the wind and what the wind has done. And then there's a really cool part in this section here where it talks about the wind not only shaking the trees and the landscape here, but it's also influencing what's on the bottom of the sea, right? How the sea blooms in the oozy woods, those are at the bottom. The foliage is even underneath on the bottom of the sea. It likewise is being influenced by this wild spirit. So this wild spirit, this transcendent spirit, is not only here on the physical landscape, but is able to move underwater and make the sea foliage, right? The seaweed and the kelp move back and forth as well. It's able to influence there. Thy voice, and suddenly grow gray with fear, and tremble and despoil themselves. O fear. So we still have two more sections to close out this poem, so we'll be right back.